Like, it feels like Halloween was like 2 days ago, and it's already the 8th of November. I always feel like this month goes so fast. It always feels like it's so quick. But is everyone hanging in there? Surviving? Hopefully you're hanging in there. We're almost there, right? There's not that much left. It's kind of surprising if you look at it. We have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 classes left. That's it. So we're definitely getting there. So try and hang in there as best as you can. Talk about more about pregnancy today. That makes you feel better, right? Again, I love this topic. So thank you for letting me share all my story with you last time. And what we'll talk about today are some of the kind of the physical experiences that come with pregnancy, kind of the process of labor and childbirth. So the second part of this chapter. And then don't forget, like if you're looking at the schedule, that 1 week from today, that second assignment is due. So just to continue to make sure that it's on your mind. So I purposefully, as I said, put that before Thanksgiving. So hopefully you would have that done and could enjoy your time a little bit more. Okay. So we left off, if I go back, we left off here, like we talked about the 3 different trimesters and the different fruits and sizes. So now the experience of pregnancy, but any thoughts or questions, anything from last time before I keep going, just to check real quick, any thoughts or anything from last time? Okay. So every woman has a very different kind of emotional and physical reaction to pregnancy. They might even have different reactions and different experiences from one pregnancy to another, right? Some people are very sick throughout the process of pregnancy, other people not at all. It's kind of a huge range of experiences. My partner during our first pregnancy gained like 40 pounds with our daughter and then lost weight with our twins, which you would think would go the other way, but she had so much morning sickness that she couldn't eat hardly anything at all. So I ate for her, right? I'm good like that. But it's very common for people to have physical like experiences, right? There's a lot going on in your body, a lot of hormonal things that are happening. Like there's a lot of random stuff that happens, right? Because like, the hormone levels that are so high in your system. So people experience a lot of like physical symptoms like exhaustion and pain. Like when you get later into pregnancy and the weight of those babies or baby are starting to be there, right? You might get hip pain and foot pain and all sorts of stuff like that. People's hair can sometimes fall out. My partner lost a toenail like randomly, right? Because again, all those vitamins and minerals and things in your body, they're going to the baby, your babies instead. And morning sickness is really, really common. It's kind of a misnomer, right? We tend to think that it happens only in the morning, but this can be at any time of the day. It's when people start to feel nauseous. They oftentimes will vomit. Very common in the second trimester. So early in pregnancy and then into the second trimester, and then it usually goes away. Though some people can have this throughout the entire pregnancy, and other people never experience it at all. It has to do with the increase of hormones, especially estrogen, and it tends to make you feel kind of nauseous. So it's more likely to happen in the morning, which is where the name comes from, but it really can be at any time of day. And again, most people, it goes away after a matter of weeks, but for some, it can definitely persist. Partners can often have kind of profound experiences too. There's a really interesting phenomenon called Couvade syndrome. Couvade is French for to hatch. And it's this interesting thing that can happen where sometimes people who are partners with someone who's pregnant can experience morning sickness and pains and even like almost like small labor pains in a way as well. When they go into labor, they can be nauseous as well. It's just kind of like a very empathetic reaction. Sometimes when people in our lives are experiencing something, we start to experience it too. And that can happen a little bit with pregnancy. It's obviously on a much lesser level, but it is something that can happen. Sex during pregnancy, kind of an interesting debate. Typically, doctors will allow any kind of like sex to occur all the way up until somebody goes into labor, right? So unless there's like a medical issue, that would maybe make it dangerous, usually this is something that's totally fine. It gets more and more complicated the larger that a woman gets, the larger her stomach gets. You might have to change positions or kind of accommodate for that in some ways, but it usually is fine unless someone has like an issue with their placenta or an issue with like blood pressure, a bunch of different things that can happen, which we'll talk about in a slide or two. But usually it's fine and not really a huge deal, though. There's a lot of literature to say that women are more interested in sex during pregnancy. Typically, it's the opposite, right? Because they have something moving inside of them, which can oftentimes be very distracting and off-putting. They might not be feeling well due to morning sickness and other like physical things happening. So it often depends on the person, but typically people are less interested in sex, especially the longer they get into pregnancy and the larger they become. I have a clip from a movie that I want to play for you about physical symptoms. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. I have a couple of clips from it. What to expect when expecting. It's based off of a book, probably the most famous and prominent book related to pregnancy. But there is a clip of this woman, Wendy, who is experiencing so many physical symptoms, from like urinating herself because she's lost control of her bladder. Babies put pressure on the bladder, and so that can happen, to all sorts of things. So I'll play this clip for you. I think it's a great example. She kind of gets things on the more severe end of the spectrum, symptoms and things that can happen, and that can be the case for some people, especially with hormones. A lot of people struggle to control their emotions really intensely, actually, after childbirth, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there are a lot of things like morning sickness and physical things and soreness, right? A lot of stuff that can happen as your body changes throughout the process of pregnancy. Really important to be getting a lot of prenatal care, right? So prenatal, remember, before birth, right? So very common from the moment you find out that you're pregnant, that you're going to the doctor regularly, right? Your baby is being checked, you're being checked. And so your health and nutrition are really, really important for fetal development. You want to make sure you do everything in your power. And there are obviously a lot of things that can go wrong if you don't follow these things. And sadly, there are things that can go wrong even when you do everything correct. There's always the person who does everything right and has things that happen anyway, and the people who do nothing right and everything's perfect, right? So you want to try and get good care. The placenta is the part of the body for a woman that is attached to the uterine wall, connects to the baby via the umbilical cord, which is why there are so many rules about what you can put in your body and not put in your body. Everything that a woman ingests goes directly to the baby, right? Through the placenta and through the umbilical cord. What are some of the things that you're not supposed to like consume when you're pregnant? Anyone know? What are some of the things that you shouldn't put into your system? Yeah. Yeah. Any type of drug, like alcohol or any kind of a drug. Yeah. Fish, right? Certain types of fish are really high in mercury, and the body can't break it down. It goes directly to the fetus. Did you have your hand, or did they? She said it? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Caffeine's a really interesting gray area. Like a little bit of caffeine is okay, but too much of it can actually like overstimulate the fetus and cause problems later. There's certain like deli meats that you're not supposed to have. There's a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
Something that 10 years ago.
Yeah.
This thing.
Uh-huh.
And for some random reason, maybe it's because we're in Chatsworth, my mom was really high in uranium.
Huh.
And I came out and I had like 5 times the level of uranium in me than my mom did.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Scary a little bit, right?
But
Yeah.
I was thinking, since I have so much more, it's probably because she had a bunch in
Right.
her and it transferred to me.
Yeah, that's very common, right? That like when a person who's pregnant is ingesting things, and it could just be stuff that's in like the water and in like the system of things that they're consuming, like it goes directly to the baby, right? And so it's something you have to be very careful with. Like alcohol is a really dangerous one. Smoking, cigarettes, and the nicotine and the oxygen deprivation that can come from smoking is one of the most dangerous things you can do when you're pregnant for the health of the baby. Like fetal alcohol syndrome, very common that if like a woman is drinking, they can cause disruption in their baby's development, their cognitive development and physical development. If they're taking drugs, those drugs go directly to the baby. There have been plenty of cases of babies being born already addicted to certain substances because the parent was using them. So it's really important to avoid things that are considered like teratogens, like harmful chemicals or harmful substances, because they go directly to that baby. Yeah.
If you were taking a prescribed medication,
Mm-hmm.
like say an anti-anxiety.
Sure.
Would you have to stop?
Yeah. Yeah, it depends. So, yeah, right. So let's say that you're on an antidepressant, right? Because you struggle with depression. What would happen is you would have a conversation with your doctor or psychiatrist weighing the pros and cons. So if your depression is so severe that you're not going to be okay without it, it might be worth it to stay on it, worth the risk. But if it's milder and could potentially be managed, ideally they would take you off of it because that can definitely be toxic for a baby. So it's tricky because sometimes people need the medication to the point where like that's going to be more beneficial, even with the side effects that are possible. So it typically ends up being like a conversation that you have to weigh both sides. But yeah, it would be ideally you would go off of it. Yeah.
I have the same conversation.
Yeah.
So offs, really safe for like.
Yeah.
One that they get like younger women because they like is more common than times.
Yeah.
I was talking about it, he's like Zoloft's the safest one and you can stay on.
Yeah, Zoloft and bupropion or Wellbutrin, both of those tend to be safer. Some are safer. So it might also be that instead of like going off everything, that you go to something that is more tolerable, or is broken down a little better by the body, like Zoloft or Wellbutrin, and Lexapro's not too bad either. There's a few that aren't as intense. But yeah, it is a conversation to have, especially if you're considering getting pregnant or are pregnant. You have to be careful with that stuff. Yeah. My partner was crazy about everything that was, so like I told you, it cost $48,000 to have our first, right? So like she put nothing in her body. Like there was one point where she drank like a caffeinated beverage on accident and made herself throw up. She's like, nope, not doing it. Like she'd be sick, no cold medicine, right? Headache, nothing, like refused to put anything in her body, which I admired so much, right? Like I'm not sure I could have done it, but I would have been a mess pregnant. I'm like way too sensitive, like no thank you. But my partner is a tough cookie, so she managed to do that all the way through. But it's just important to monitor those things, and those are conversations you have with a doctor when you go in for your checkups, because you're trying to avoid issues, right? And the more risks that you take, the more risk that you're going to have, right? And so there are cases where people have miscarriages and sometimes or spontaneous abortion, and sometimes this happens no matter what you do, right? You can do all the right things, and like as all of the biology of that baby is unfolding, something is wrong, right? Very common that these happen in the first trimester, much less common after that, but it definitely can happen. My sister-in-law had a miscarriage the day before her baby was supposed to be born. Like had a scheduled C-section on Tuesday, on Monday. The baby was so large, 13 pounds. It's huge. That's the size of two babies. 13 pounds. This baby got the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck and it choked him, and he was never born. So this can happen later, but it's much more common to happen in the first trimester. It can happen, as I said, at any time. The first trimester is most dangerous. Preeclampsia is a very common condition that women can develop toward the end of pregnancy, where they get high blood pressure or hypertension and they have to be monitored. There can be issues with the placenta. So all of these things have to be monitored by a doctor, which is why it's good to be going in for regular care. And oftentimes when you do go in, they do ultrasounds. Ultrasounds are really, really common during pregnancy. They're monitoring the growth of the baby. They're monitoring things like, can we determine what sex the baby is, which is usually around like weeks 14 to 16 or somewhere in there. So with an ultrasound, you get these images like this. right? The black and white is kind of the traditional image. You can also do 3D ones, which are a little bit more fun to look at. They're a little easier to see what's going on. But they put this like jelly on your stomach, right, as a conductant, and then they do this very non-invasive, it's not a painful test at all, and it allows you to see what's happening with the baby. I think I have let me see here, I think I have a little like, yep, I do. Let me play this for you just for a second so you can with the fluid surrounding the baby and so on. So lots and lots of ultrasounds along the way. Especially as you get closer to the end. You're also looking for gender or sex at some point as well. There's a lot of screening options that you can do when you're pregnant. We didn't do any of these because it took us so long to get pregnant that we were willing to have whatever we were going to have at that point. But a lot of people do some kind of genetic screening to see if their baby or babies might be at a higher risk for certain developmental disorders or genetic issues. You can do things like these are the most common ones. Amniocentesis is like the old standard or standby. That's what's happening in the image with this very long needle that goes in through the abdomen or abdominal wall. And what they do is they take a small sample of the fluid surrounding the baby, which we call the amniotic fluid. And what you can do from that fluid is test it to see if they have any chromosomal abnormalities. You can determine the sex of the fetus with 100% certainty. You do this typically around like 15 to 20 weeks into pregnancy. So this is something that a lot of people will do. It'll tell you if you have like a higher prevalency of like Down syndrome or certain like things like cerebral palsy and so on. There's a couple of newer ones that are starting to gain popularity. There's one called chorionic villus sampling, which is starting to become more popular. It's a more refined procedure. They take a little bit of tissue from the placenta, and then they check that for abnormalities, and they do it a little bit earlier. The nice part about doing it a little bit earlier is if there is an issue that might cause a conversation about something like an abortion, for example, right? It's much earlier. That fetus is still very, very tiny compared to 20 weeks. They're much bigger, right? So that's the big advantage of that. And then this one, the maternal serum alpha fetoprotein screening is another one. It's a blood test that you can do where you don't even need to affect anything like internal. It's just blood work. But the idea with all of these is that they give you a percentage of how likely you are for your baby to have like a genetic issue. A lot of inaccurate results with these, which is why people use them so like in such a mixed way. My nephew, his blood work came back, or his amniocentesis came back, that he had a 99% chance of Down syndrome. Right, he's now 23 and he had no Down syndrome. Right, and his mom almost aborted him because it was like 99% certainty. And she's like, you know what, I will love him. I will do the best that I can. We'll see what happens. He came out perfectly healthy, no genetic defect whatsoever. You get a lot of like false positives or even false negatives with these, but they are done quite a bit, right? The idea is to give you some warning, and then you can also make up your mind of what you want to do with that information. Any like thoughts or questions or comments or anything so far before we keep going? Yeah. It could if you were doing it a lot, right? And usually this is like a one-time procedure, so it's not considered to be dangerous. So you would be doing an ultrasound. See how they're doing an ultrasound to make sure that the baby's nowhere near the needle. But you wouldn't want to be doing this repeatedly, right? And disturbing that environment. But once or even twice, not thought to be dangerous, but obviously much more than that could be, right? So yeah, I mean, it's something kind of, again, to weigh the risks. As people get farther along into their pregnancy, they might start preparing for childbirth. Very common for people and even couples to take prepared childbirth classes, things like Lamaze, or even just like educating yourself on what are all the different medications I can take as I'm in the process of labor, what are my birthing options, coming up with a birthing plan. One of the other great things about these classes is you're surrounded by other people who are in the same process of pregnancy. And so sometimes people make friendships here and they can persist after the babies are born. But really common to do these breathing exercises, labor coaches, stretching techniques to handle the pain and like things of labor. They teach you how to like put on a diaper and all the things that you might not know how to do, how to swaddle. I remember they gave us these fake little like doll babies and we had to swaddle them, and I swaddled mine and dropped it. Like the teacher of the class looked mortified. She's like, "You dropped him." I'm like, "Jacques is fine." I named him Jacques. I don't know. I was like, "He'll be fine," right? Like I won't drop the real baby. And she looked mortified. She's like, "You don't get a baby." I'm like, "I'm having two, so back up." Right. But you do so many things like that to help you get ready. Because it's stuff that you might not know, right? Like if you don't have other people in your life who have babies, you might not know what you're doing. And so taking these classes can be really helpful. A lot of people also hire somebody else to help them. It's not uncommon for people to hire a midwife or a doula, right? Both of them tend to have kind of a supportive role, but they're like an intermediary between the doctor and the family. And so oftentimes people will consider like having somebody there as like a resource or a point of help. But these classes can be really, really helpful. Again, from that movie Baby Mama, I found like two really like short clips of their classes. Prepare for what's ahead, right? Different techniques. The bouncy ball, very common as people are progressing through labor, that they have like techniques like being on a ball like that, or walking or stretching or breathing. And that's all stuff that you would go over in these classes, right? And again, oftentimes people make connections and friendships through them as well. So you've gone through all of that, and now getting close to labor at this point, right? And as people get later and later into their pregnancy, they start to have like practice contractions. Practice contractions are called Braxton Hicks contractions. And it's these little like contractions of the uterus that are almost like a warm up to labor. Now, labor is quite a process, right? And I don't know if any of you have ever been through labor or watched somebody go through labor, but it is a lot. There's a lot of variability, right? It tends to be much longer for first pregnancies than later pregnancies. And there are a lot of things that can kind of go awry, if you will. So when you start to get close to the end of pregnancy, somewhere around like 37, 38 weeks is the most common for when a child is born. The first stage of labor is when you start to have contractions and start to feel that pain a little bit, right? And this can last on average like 10 to 16 hours for the first baby, and like 4 to 8 hours or even less for later babies. But what's happening is your cervix is effacing and dilating. So during pregnancy, the cervix is completely closed, right? That's up at the top back of the vaginal canal. It's completely closed up, right? To keep all of that fluid in, to protect the environment that that baby is in. As you enter into labor, what labor is the cervix starting to dilate and open up, okay? And it has to open up to make room for that baby to come out. So as it starts to open, right, that opening process, your body is contracting, and there's like a lot of muscular contractions happening in your uterus and stomach. That's where the pain comes from. That's what's happening in the body. So the cervix is dilating or opening and effacing, starting to kind of stretch and thin out to make room for that baby to come out of the body. So in the first stage of labor, about 10 to 16 hours, it's happening very, very slowly, right? And there tends to be a rule that we follow. It's the 5-1-1 rule. Now, you tend to see in the media, right? A woman's water breaks, they go to the hospital. That actually doesn't happen very often, right? Typically what happens when somebody's in labor, once they become dilated enough, right? Once this is open enough, their bag of waters, which is actually what it's called, all of that like fluid will come out. And that's what we call water breaking. Now, at some points, that's actually like you're quite a bit into labor when that happens. It most commonly happens when people are actively pushing their baby out. but we see it in the media of like, oh, what's that water? Like, oh, my water broke, I gotta go to the hospital. That can happen, but it's not the norm. So what we have instead is something we call the 511 rule. If your water breaks, you go to the hospital. You've got 24 hours or less to deliver that baby at that point because there's nothing surrounding the baby anymore. But the 511 rule is like a general rule that people have when your contractions are 5 minutes apart. So you're having active contractions. They're 5 minutes apart. They last for 1 minute each. For 1 hour. So when somebody has contractions that are lasting for a minute, 5 minutes apart for 1 hour, at that point, they should go to the hospital. They're in active labor. Okay, so you're timing this, right? Very common, and they never tell you about this. People go to the hospital for false alarms with pregnancy a lot. You think you're in labor, and then they send you home, and then you go back again, and they send you home, and they go back again and send you home, right? It's something that happens quite a bit. We went 4 times with our first, like to the point where they were like, I don't think you're in labor. Hi again, right? And we're like, okay, but we're here, right? We're here. Nope, go home. See you in like a day or two, right? So like this happens a lot. You go to labor and delivery at the hospital. They check to see, are you actually starting to dilate? Are you actually starting to open up? If you're not, and you don't meet this rule, they send you home, right? And you might be kind of going in and out pretty regularly at that point, trying to know when you're in labor. But this first stage is when everything is starting. The second stage of labor is when you're actively pushing that baby out, right? Actively pushing them out of the vaginal canal. And this happens once you are fully dilated. So once you're completely opened up, your cervix is open as far as it will go, about 10 centimeters. At that point, you actively push the baby out of your body. This tends to last about 30 minutes to 2 hours. It can't go much longer than that because it's not safe for the baby. So if after like an hour and a half to 2 hours, the baby hasn't come out, at that point, they might consider something like a C-section, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is you actively pushing the baby out. And we sometimes hear this term called crowning at this point, where you can see the baby's head. That's what's happening in the last image over there. And then once the baby is out of the body, there's actually a very short third stage that we never talk about, where you deliver the afterbirth. It's like one last little push, and the placenta and all of that afterbirth material comes out of the body. Right. So this whole process can be, like 18 plus hours for the first baby, not to mention all of the like practice contractions and things that happen before you're in active labor. I have this image for you just for reference. So when the cervix is closed, right, it's not open at all. 1 centimeter is a Cheerio, 2 is a lifesaver, a banana for 3, a Nilla wafer for 4, an Oreo for 5, tomato for 6, like an English muffin, and then a bagel, right? So by the time you had to do food, sorry. By the time you hit fully dilated, you're looking at an opening about that big, right? Or maybe even a little bit bigger. Any thoughts or questions, anything at all at the moment? I have a video I want to show you. It's another part of that same movie from the What to Expect When Expecting. So what it is, it's about 20 minutes, maybe 17 minutes or so. And it's multiple couples going through the process of childbirth or getting a baby. One couple actually adopts a baby. And then the other ones go through like a vaginal birth. They're going to talk about pain. They're going to talk about epidurals. And then they'll show you that process. So let me bring this up here, and then we'll watch it. And then we could talk about the different elements of it. So it's a couple of different people going through their process of labor and childbirth. And then we can talk about. Here we go. All right.
And week finale. We're just moments away from finding out who our big, or shall I say,
portrayal of kind of a couple of different experiences, right? Probably the most unrealistic, sneezing and the baby pops out with no pain. Probably not going to happen. I will tell you, the labor and delivery wing of a hospital is an intimidating place to walk by. There's a lot of screaming happening in that wing, because again, it's an intense like process that people are going through, but there are a lot of different methods for like pain management. And they kind of bring that up a little bit in that clip. Really common for people to get an epidural. An epidural is when they take a needle and they inject like a numbing agent kind of near the spine. It's in the back. And so you sit on this chair and they come in and they do this. And what it does is it blocks the pain from your waist down. Now, the moment you get an epidural, your chances of a C-section go through the roof. Because what happens is it basically numbs you, which means you aren't as able to push as if you didn't get an epidural. So there are advantages and disadvantages to every like pain management strategy. Taking like medicine like morphine or things like that can go directly to the baby, so not the safest. Epidurals are generally pretty safe, but again, if you take them, you have a higher risk of a C-section. Some people will do childbirth just completely naturally. They'll have no medications, no painkillers. Some people learn like hypnotherapy kind of methods of like breathing to manage their pain. It's kind of all over the place. My partner had a really, really atypical labor. Her blood pressure was through the roof with our first baby. So we had with Kaya, so we had preeclampsia. And so they had to induce her labor. So she hadn't gone into labor on her own. They gave her a drug that caused her to go into labor called Pitocin. And because her blood pressure was so high, they had to give her another drug called magnesium. So she couldn't get out of bed and couldn't move, which meant that she was almost certainly doomed for a C-section, though she made every effort to not have to have one. So she was in labor for 2 days, which is a long time, right? 10 to 16 hours is what you're promised. It was 48 hours, and I didn't sleep the entire 48 hours we were in the hospital because I was like, it could come at any time. I was like, we're way overdue here, right? And so by the time our like first was born, I was so sleep deprived already, which is not the best spot to start out in. But after like 48 hours of labor, they broke her water like for her. So with like almost looked like a crochet hook, like broke her bag of water to make labor come even faster. She pushed for 2 hours and then ended up having a C-section. So it was 3 days of time in the hospital before our oldest was born. And during the C-section, they had to like vacuum her out. Like she didn't want to leave the body, apparently. Like Kaya wanted to stay in partner forever. But like they had to like take a little vacuum to suck her out because she was stuck. But when she was born, totally fine. Everything was fine from there. It was just a long process. And then with our second ones, it was a scheduled C-section. Once you've had a C-section once, you typically have a C-section again. You can have what's called a VBAC or go back to a vaginal birth, but it's pretty common if you've ever had a C-section that you end up having one a second time. And that's really the most common non-traditional delivery method. They're very common. A lot of reasons you might give somebody a C-section, right? The baby's too big. The baby's not in the right position. You have more than one baby, right? If you have twins or more, typically you're going to end up with a C-section. They go in and make an incision in the abdomen and through the abdomen, through the uterus, and then they pull the baby out like with their hands. It is a massive surgery, but it is a very common surgery. It's done quite a bit. You enter into like an operating room and there's a team for the mom and then there's a team for the baby or babies. And then they pull the baby out and then like sew the mom back up. It takes about 2 days to recover from. It's a little longer that you're in the hospital than if you had a vaginal birth. And you're medicated, obviously, so you ideally don't feel anything, right? You have what's called a spinal a lot of the time, which is more intense than an epidural. They literally numb you from like the chest down so that you don't feel anything. But it is, again, like kind of an invasive procedure. And there's a lot of blood, a lot of people in there. I wasn't expecting how intense that was. People pass out, right? I was like, if you're going through surgery, I better not pass out. Like I'll be dead. Like I would get killed afterwards. So, but a lot of people do. They warned me. They're like, you can't, you might pass out from the blood. And I'm like, oh no, I won't. I'm like, I will not. My partner will kill me. If she needed birth to 2 babies, I could stay awake, right? It's the least I can do. So, but it's a wild procedure, but it's very common, right? Usually when people just can't seem to get that baby to come out on its own. Any questions about any of the childbirth stuff for the moment? There's like two more up here, but about the medications or the process of delivery or labor or any of that for the moment? Yeah.
So one thing that thought of was being born prematurely.
Yeah,
So I guess what are some of the effects that can have?
sure. No, it's a great question. So technically, so a pregnancy technically is 40 weeks, right? Most babies are born right around like 38 weeks or so. Anything before week 37 is considered premature. So very common when people have multiples that their babies are born early, just because the body, it's so much going on that the body tends to push them out earlier. But if a baby is born before 37 weeks, they tend to go what's called the NICU, which is the neonatal intensive care unit. And they might need to finish like developing and growing in like an incubator of sorts if they're really early. The earliest baby that has been born and survived was 24 weeks. That's really early. And this baby had like massive complications and developmental issues. If a baby's born around like 35, 36 weeks, they tend to be just fine. They just need a little extra care to get them a little stronger and finish off. But if they're born really early, they might be in like an incubator where you have to like have them stay in the hospital for weeks. And it could be like a little bit like dangerous, depending on how early it is. So it's really common for babies to come early. There's also cases where babies don't come and they have to induce labor and like you're at 42 weeks and the baby hasn't come yet and you have to like pull the baby out. So too early or too late can cause complications. Typically it's a neonatal intensive care unit that they'll stay until they're grown enough to then go through the process like me.
At least in my family, there's sort of a joke that my dad was born immature.
Okay.
I was born later, so they had to induce labor.
Yeah.
And then we always clown on my mom for being born on the exact day.
Got it, right it all, got the range of outcomes. I love that, right? Yeah. Of what? What sure. So the second that you are pregnant, right? Within like a matter of, I want to say it's about 2 weeks, you develop what's called an amniotic sac, right? So the baby becomes enveloped in this little sac. And that sac is filled with like just fluid that's in the body. And it's interesting because that sac is actually separated for 3 months. And it's very adaptive that way because a lot of women don't know that they're pregnant right off the bat. And then what happens is that sac just enlarges as the baby enlarges and it's filled with fluid, right? And so the baby's actually breathing in the fluid. That fluid gets influenced by anything that the mom eats. If they're dehydrated, there might not be enough fluid. And it's something that they have to monitor closely because if that fluid is in short supply, it's a huge risk for the baby. So that fluid surrounds and cushions the baby, nurtures the baby. That placenta then takes over when they're about 3 months old, and they're starting to get bigger and need more nutrients. And so that's what ruptures when the baby's getting ready to be born. That actually fuels this idea of like, because they're like growing in water, there's some thoughts that they should be born into water, and that it's less harsh for that baby, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Is there any, I mean, is there any direct correlation or something that the mother is doing to the weight of the baby? Like, you know, some babies literally cannot, like 13 pounds.
Yeah.
Like, will do kind of the same thing as like the mother who had that baby at 7 pounds.
Sure. Yeah.
Something that caused.
Yeah. Sometimes if like the woman is larger, they'll have larger children. That tends to be like their bone structure might affect the bone structure of the children. So my partner's sister, like she has 2 kids. This is the one that lost a baby that was 13 pounds, but her other 2, one was 12 and a half and one was 11 and a half. That's really big. Those are big babies. And they were both born by C-section because they were too big to be delivered vaginally. And she's kind of got a larger bone structure. So that tends to have a big correlation. Ours were like our oldest was 9 pounds, 2 ounces, right? Numbers that you hold on to, right? 9 pounds, 2 ounces. And like, that's big for a baby. Like it's usually like 6, 7 pounds is normal. And then our twins are almost always smaller. So Paisley was 5 pounds. She was so little, like I was afraid to touch her, like changing her diaper. It was so tiny, right? And then Emma was 7'15". right? So it's kind of all over the place, right? If the mom has good health and is eating regularly and the babies are developing normally, they tend to be within a very narrow range of like 6-7 pounds. But if you have a larger woman or a larger bone structure in the family, that tends to play a big role. So it's kind of all over the place. But yeah, 11, anything over like 10 pounds is a pretty large baby and will probably dictate that they have to have a C-section, right? Because it's just too large to come out on its own. Anything else? Any other questions for now? I forgot to mention hypnobirthing, or kind of casually mentioned it. Like some people will do this as a way of like natural pain relief, right? Where they just focus on their breathing. But there are a lot of options, which is why those childbirth classes are so helpful. They give you an overview of everything that you have available to you. And then you can kind of decide, you make your birth plan, and sometimes that goes out the window. I love, she's like, but I typed it, right? Like that makes it set in stone, right? You can go in with a birth plan. It's good to have an idea of what you would like to do. But oftentimes you have to pivot, which is why it's nice to know about your options before that moment so you can have a conversation about it. Yeah.
Baby like bleeds in the fluid.
Yeah.
Like how does it not hurt? I don't know. It's
Yeah.
you know, like how are they getting the correct oxygen level?
Yeah.
You know,
The oxygen is all in the fluid, right? And so it's interesting. We're like completely filled with fluid and like breathing it in and not a problem. And then when they're born, they actually kind of suck that little bit of fluid out, and then they get that first cry. And then they breathe oxygen after that. So that's the idea here, is that like, what if we give birth into water so that it's not as harsh of a transition for that baby? Because it's a harsh, they go from like this warm, like enclosed, like breathing fluid to like air and like, and being cold. It's a very harsh like transition, which is why there's a lot of like people who do water births.
where you're born and like breathing air, did you be able to breathe something similar to the amniotic fluid with the oxygen? Like, is that possible? Because obviously, you know, you can't breathe in water, you'll drown because lungs fill up with water. So like, I
mean, it seems hypothetically possible, but I don't think that it's something that we're like, I don't know if any of you've seen the movie The Abyss. That just reminded me of that movie. It's an old movie, but they developed this way of doing that as a form of like deep diving technique, that they breathe in, that they're surrounded by fluid instead of oxygen. It's not something that we can do, but it makes hypothetical sense. But completely surrounded by and engulfed in fluid and breathing in fluid, and then switches to air when we're born, and then we never go back. Right? It's wild. The whole thing is wild, really. Anything else? Any other questions, comments, thoughts, anything else? Yeah, stories. Okay.
So by the time the midwife got there, she was pregnant.
Okay.
But she had told us we could watch.
Mm-hmm.
I was like 7, my brother was 5, and I went to the door, and my grandma was like, "Go away."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the poor woman.
Yeah.
Situation with no medical thing and everything. But then my mom got up and had dinner with us, and the work when she went to the hospital right after she's done, she's like, "I'm ready to go."
Yeah.
Check it out.
Yeah. By the time you've done 4 of them, right? It's wild because they typically, what's pretty common, like it depends on your insurance, right? But like if you give birth in a hospital, if you give vaginal birth, they typically keep you 1 night, maybe 2, right? Maybe 2. Like 2 would be if, like, depending on the time of when you gave birth, right? So all of our kids were born in like the late afternoon, or the early evening. One of them, I was in the middle of class when we went into labor. I was like, all right, turn your stuff in, I'm out, right? Like I gotta go, right? But they, like we're all born in the afternoon, so we stayed 1 night for our first one, and then or 2 nights for our first one, 1 night for our second one. And so if you have a C-section, they usually keep you like 2 to 3 nights, and then they let you go. It's kind of whenever the woman has recovered enough to leave. And I think the more babies that you have, you know, probably the more that you know what you need to do. With the C-section, you have to be able to get up and walk around before they let you leave. They're monitoring your stitches. Those first nights, in the hospital are tough. You're like, I'm worn out, I'm exhausted from this huge process, and now you have a baby that sleeps for 20 minutes. You know, and so it's a little like overwhelming. The nice part about being there is you have the support and help of the nurses, and they can show you stuff to do as well, that you might not know. So yeah, I have some people stay days, other people, it's like, okay, I'm good, you know, let me out, and they go home. And other people are born at home, you know. Yeah.
Do it.
Hmm. Let's do this. Yeah.
I swear it took her 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just like,
Yeah.
so much better than one.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I can imagine. Right. And with subsequent babies, it happens so fast because your body knows what to do. Like a woman who's had like 2 to 3 to 4 babies, by the last one, the whole process of labor could take 30 minutes. Like that's it. Like, oh, I'm in contractions. Oh, the baby's crowning. Oh, look, we have a baby. It's been 25 minutes. Like it literally can be that fast if your body has gone through it before. It's just, it knows what to do. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
She.
You're like, I'm sorry, I didn't know.
I know.
Right.
But she. Here, and they said that like 4% thing, is
Yeah.
that like something that you can like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your placenta, the part that like nourishes the baby with the oxygen, food, waste elimination, everything, right, is very sensitive, right? So if people can have what's called a placenta previa, where it starts to pull away from the wall and it doesn't work, they can have damage to the placenta from injury. So sometimes people, when they're toward the end of pregnancy, get put on bed rest, if you've ever heard of that happening. It's typically because the placenta has some kind of disruption. And in those cases too, you're not encouraged to have sex at all, and nothing that could disrupt that whole environment. You have to be very careful, right? The placenta, if something ruptures with it or happens with it, can put the baby in great danger, because it's the direct lifeline in a way. And as a side note, when people are going through labor, oftentimes people will go on walks or have certain foods. If you cause somebody, it's a very common strategy to engage in sex to induce labor, right? I think that's like a pickup line that somebody came up with, right? Like, you want to have that baby? Let's go, right? Let's do this, right? Like you said. But if you can cause a woman to have like an orgasm toward the end of pregnancy, sometimes that can trigger labor. So can a walk, by the way, just as a counter, right? I mean, I tried to plead my case. My partner's like, let's just go on a walk. Right? No, fine, fine. So like going on a walk or using the up and down like those big bouncy balls can help move the baby along. There are places that have like salads that are supposed to be labor inducing. It's more like expectancy and placebo than anything. There's teas that are supposed to reduce labor. They don't really work either. So there's a lot of things like that. If you want to like sum up my partner in one story, I feel like I have one story quickly that sums up my partner to the T. She went into labor with our firstborn and she's like, let's clean the house. So when we come home with this baby, we have a clean house. I was like, you're in active labor right now. She's like, well, you can vacuum, I'll do everything else. I was like, are you kidding me right now? Like, we clean the house in the middle of active labor because my partner didn't want to give to a T right there. Pretty unrealistic in one direction. The other one kind of severe in the other, but people do have complications. It definitely happens. It's less than it used to be, but it's definitely possible. We'll cover this one next time since we only have about a minute left. So I'll stop here. We'll finish this up and then we move on to chapter 15. So we kind of jump a little bit. STIs, something to look forward to for next time. And we will have a guest speaker probably on Wednesday next week from the health center coming in to talk about that, which I think is kind of fun. She's great. I think she's wonderful. So we'll finish this, then we'll move to STIs. So have a wonderful weekend and I will see you next week.